Doug, let me start with you. Sometimes when I try to point out these misquotes, these misattributions, this sloppiness, this misleading rhetoric, I get a lot of people to respond to me on social media and say, Brian, we know, you don't need to tell us at this point. Is there any value anymore, Doug, in trying to point out the daily deflections and spin?
You know, there's so much noise these days that it's hard to filter things through. I think it's important to point out where things are right and wrong. And let me say in full disclosure, since you showed the Jeanine Pirro interview earlier, I had been invited on that show several times before I joined CNN. And I'm really proud to say that I said no every time, and not just because it was on a Saturday night. This show and other shows on Fox and other shows on other networks, I think take their rhetoric to the extreme. I think there's no better example of that than Jeanine Pirro's show, is why I'm proud that I always said no to their show. But look, yeah, of course, it's important to hold any politician accountable. I will say, though, as a conservative, there are a lot of us who feel that all the fact checkers who have set themselves up to be essentially independent arbiters of truth have their own biases that need to be brought out. And that's why you see so many negative reactions from not just Republicans on Capitol Hill, but folks at CPAC and conservatives in the media as well. Fact-checking is important, but we need to make sure that it's done on an even-handed level. Trump creates some of the biases against him on his own, which is its own problem.
Sarah, what's your impression? You were at CPAC for a few days. You heard President Trump up there on stage. He was giving really a campaign-style stump speech. Is this what he prefers to be doing, trying to go back to what worked so well for him during the campaign?
I think we've seen that more and more, whether it's calling into a Fox show, which was a tactic that he deployed very frequently during the campaign to allow him to sort of blitz all media coverage, to these more freewheeling speeches, which is obviously his preference, rather than giving the structured kind of remarks that are required of a president. President Trump really feeds off the energy of crowds. So the CPAC crowd was very friendly. I think that his speech sort of went off the rails at certain points because he was sort of interacting with the audience. At one point, I'm sure you noticed, he inexplicably asked the audience to clap for whether they preferred tax cuts to the Second Amendment. It's something that doesn't totally make a lot of sense intellectually, but he was loving the fact that the crowd was loving him, and I think that amped him up a lot.
Dan Rather, as someone who has been covering presidents for decades, have you seen this kind of fantasy land thinking or behavior before?
No, we've certainly seen behavior we didn't like in presidents, but we've never seen anything like this. This is new, and I do think that most people get it, that most people understand that they're facing on a daily basis from the White House and from the president himself the rough equivalent. You're facing a fertilizer spreader in a windstorm, and it is past the point of shock with the president. That Donald Trump, in his mind, you can argue he's delusional. He thinks he's triumphant. You say, well, he's 35% approval ratings. How can he think that? I have no explanation for it, but that's what he thinks. He does have some things going for him, the economy being for one thing. But this business on guns and the shooting in Parkland, I think has damaged his standing. I think one reason you're seeing a drop in the polls for it, 35%. But I will say this, Brian, if you want to judge where President Trump, whether he's really in deep trouble, the mark is 30%. If his approval rating gets 30% or below, this is Richard Nixon country during Watergate, 30% or above, he can probably keep himself going and hold out some hope of keeping the House and the Senate in November.
He's been between 30 and 40. CNN had him at 40% last month, now back to 35. Gallup has him at 37 right now. He's been in this same range for a while. But you say we're beyond shock at this point. Do you think there's less use then in journalists trying to check the false claims?
Not only do I think it's useful, I think it's absolutely imperative. Now more than ever is when the press needs to be a kind of truth squad for this and every other president. Is perhaps more important with President Trump because there are more untruths to set the record straight. But if journalists cower, as many in Congress, both some Republicans and some Democrats in Congress are cowering with the NRA, if journalists cower, then how long can we sing "We're the home of the brave"?
Last question, and this block goes to Doug Heye, because Doug, you were a former RNC communications director. I know you've thought about this issue of guns for a long time. How much activism do you see in the coverage in the wake of Parkland, and how much do you think journalists are overstepping their bounds?
Honestly, I see a ton of it. I think there are changes that could and should be made. but I see a ton of it on every day. And I'll tell you, if you talk to Republicans outside of Washington, D.C. on the issue of guns, abortion, gay marriage, climate change, they see an activist press that basically issues the talking points of the left every day. I was at a farm 2 weeks ago in Fletcher, North Carolina, a friend's farm of mine, where there was a big cookout. And what I heard so often was, talking about the press, was that the press essentially does act as the left. And so it's one thing to have conversations in New York and in Washington, D.C., but what people outside of the country see and hear every day is a press that they feel is against them, at least if you're talking to Republican voters, that not only echoes what Trump says, it means that they're listening to what Trump says, whether on the Jeanine Pirro show or other shows, and essentially taking marching orders from them. It's a very serious thing, and it's also why I think it's incumbent on the press to make sure that they get it right every time. If the press makes a mistake, it's not just viewed as a mistake, it's viewed as bias, and that's a problem that the press needs to deal with moving forward.